Tokyo, December 7, 1941. An island empire that controlled half the Pacific. Over 100 million people under one flag. The third largest naval power in the world. But Pearl Harbor was not an act of strength. It was an act of economic desperation. Because Japan was not expanding out of ambition, it was racing against the clock of its own bankruptcy. And what came next was not glory. It was the greatest financial implosion of the 20th century. The same trap now closing in on today's great powers. Today you'll discover how an empire fell not because of bombs, but because of the illusion that growth could be infinite. Before continuing, check if you're already subscribed to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching this video from. I love knowing how far these stories reach. It was the year 1868. Japan had just awakened from 250 years of feudal isolation, an archipelago with no natural resources, no oil, no iron, not enough coal to fuel an industrial revolution. But it had something more dangerous than resources: disciplined ambition. The Meiji Restoration transformed Japan in less than a generation, from samurai with swords to engineers with locomotives, from medieval feudalism to industrial capitalism in 40 years. It was the fastest economic miracle in history. In 1905, Japan defeated Russia militarily. It was the first time in modern history that an Asian power had defeated a European empire. The world was in shock. Europeans couldn't believe it. Asians saw hope. Japan became the model. By 1920, it was already a full-fledged industrial power. It built warships faster than Britain. It exported silk, textiles, steel, and technology. Its currency, the yen, began circulating throughout Asia with the same confidence as the British pound. And a quarter of the Pacific used Japanese products. The Zaibatsu, gigantic corporate conglomerates like Mitsubishi, Mitsui, Sumitomo, and Yasuda, controlled the entire economy. They were half business, half state. Factories, banks, shipping companies, mines, insurance firms, all under the same corporate umbrella. It was capitalism with feudal steroids. And it worked. Japan grew at 4% per year. Cities expanded. The middle class emerged. Tokyo filled with cafes, cinemas, newspapers, bookstores. There was electricity, trams, telephones. Japan seemed unstoppable. Japanese intellectuals spoke of the Asian manifest destiny. They believed Japan had a divine mission to lead Asia, to free the continent from Western colonialism, to create a co-prosperity sphere where all Asians would thrive under Japanese leadership. It was a beautiful dream, but behind the glory, something deadly was growing in silence. Absolute dependence. Japan imported 90% of its oil, 80% of its steel and iron, 100% of the rubber for its military tires, 70% of its rice came from the colonies, and every time it grew, it needed more. More steel to build ships, more oil to power planes, more coal to feed factories, more rice to feed soldiers. The problem was that Japan had none of that within its territory. It was an empire built on imports, an economic giant with feet of clay. So they did what all hungry empires do when they run out of resources. They went to get them abroad. And when an empire goes out to seize resources by force, it begins to write its own death sentence. September 18, 1931. Explosion in Mukden, Manchuria. Japanese army officers blew up a section of the railway they themselves controlled. They blamed the Chinese and used it as a pretext to invade all of Manchuria. It was a self-attack, a false flag operation, and it worked. In 6 months, Japan conquered a territory the size of France and Germany combined. They created a puppet state called Manchukuo, placed the last Chinese emperor, Puyi, as a decorative figurehead, and began extracting everything: coal, iron, soybeans, wheat, timber. Manchuria had everything Japan needed. The world protested. The League of Nations condemned the invasion. They sent investigators, wrote reports, demanded withdrawal. Japan ignored them. And in 1933, it simply withdrew from the League of Nations and accelerated militarization. Because now the war machine could no longer stop. Here began the fatal error, the original economic sin that would destroy everything. The Japanese government decided to finance military expansion through massive domestic debt. They issued patriotic bonds that citizens bought out of national duty. Schools taught that buying war bonds was an act of honor. Newspapers published lists of traitors who didn't contribute. It was social pressure turned into fiscal policy. And it worked. Japan raised billions of yen, but there was a problem. That money didn't come from real savings, it came from monetary printing disguised as patriotism. The Bank of Japan began printing unbacked yen, buying the bonds banks didn't want, directly financing the Ministry of War. They called this the total war economy, but in reality, it was a financial pyramid scheme in uniform. Each new conquest generated more military expenses. Each military expense demanded more conquests to pay the bill. It was a perfect vicious cycle, and in 1937 it exploded. The Marco Polo Bridge incident ignited the Second Sino-Japanese War. Japan invaded mainland China. They thought it would be a 3-month campaign. It lasted 8 years, and it cost far more than Japan could afford. Because China wasn't Manchuria. China was enormous. It had 400 million people. It had mountains, rivers, deserts. It had resistance. And it had help from the United States and the Soviet Union. The war in China became a bottomless pit. Japan sent 700,000 soldiers, spent millions of yen every month, but made no progress. Chinese cities were conquered and then lost again. Supplies never arrived. Supply routes were attacked by guerrillas, and the Japanese economy began to overheat. Factories produced tanks, planes, ships, and munitions day and night, but they didn't produce food. They didn't produce clothes. They didn't produce anything ordinary people could use. Civilian consumption fell by 40% between 1937 and 1941. Wages were frozen. Prices rose. Shops began to close because there was nothing to sell. Rationing became mandatory. Each family received coupons to buy rice, sugar, cloth. Inflation began to rise slowly. In 1939, prices were 15% higher than in 1937. In 1940, 25% higher, and protests began to appear in the streets. Workers demanded fair wages. Farmers refused to deliver rice to the government. Students questioned the war. Then the regime responded with brutal repression. The Kempeitai secret police arrested anyone who spoke against the war. Labor unions were banned. Newspapers were censored. Talking about peace was treason. And the government made the most dangerous decision of all, to accelerate toward the abyss. In 1940, Japan signed the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy. It officially joined the Axis. It was a massive gamble. They were betting that Hitler would win in Europe and that they could divide the world together. And when the Nazis invaded France in June 1940, Japan saw its opportunity. France had colonies in Indochina, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and now France was occupied. It couldn't defend its colonies. So Japan simply went in and took everything. Oil, rubber, rice, tin, tungsten. Everything Japan needed to continue the war was there. But there was one huge problem: the United States. Washington watched with growing alarm. Japan had invaded China. It had occupied Indochina. It was allied with Hitler, and now it was threatening British and American trade routes in the Pacific. So the United States responded with the one weapon that could break Japan without firing a single shot: an economic embargo. In July 1941, President Roosevelt froze all Japanese assets in the United States. He banned the export of oil to Japan. He banned steel. He banned synthetic rubber. Zero oil, zero steel, zero trade. And here's the detail few understand. The United States controlled 80% of the oil Japan imported. Without American oil, Japan had reserves for 6 months of war. After that, its aircraft carriers would be floating scrap metal, its planes museum pieces, its tanks steel sculptures. Japan was economically strangled, so Japanese leaders met in Tokyo and calculated their options. Option A: withdraw from China, Indochina, and Manchuria, dissolve the empire, humiliate themselves before the United States, provoke an internal military revolt, collapse politically. Option B: negotiate with the United States, give in a little, buy time. But Washington had already made it clear there would be no negotiation while Japan remained in China. Option C: strike first, destroy the U.S. fleet at Pearl Harbor, seize the Dutch oil colonies in Indonesia, create a defensive perimeter in the Pacific, force the United States to negotiate peace. They chose option C, not because they thought they could win, but because they thought they might not lose. Pearl Harbor wasn't courage. It was economic panic disguised as military strategy. It was an act of survival, and it was there that the empire began to die. And no one noticed until it was too late. The first 6 months after Pearl Harbor were months of sweeping victory. Japan destroyed the U.S. fleet in Hawaii. It conquered the Philippines, Hong Kong, Singapore, Burma, Malaysia, Indonesia. Thailand, dozens of islands in the Pacific. It was the fastest military expansion in history. By May 1942, the Japanese Empire controlled a territory stretching from the Aleutians in the north to northern Australia in the south, from Burma in the west to the Marshall Islands in the east. It was the largest Asian empire since the Mongols, and the Japanese people celebrated. Newspapers published maps showing the new Asian order. Children sang patriotic songs. Generals were treated as living gods, but each victory made them weaker, because now they had to administer an empire stretching 10,000 kilometers. They had to defend 1,000 islands with limited resources, feed millions of civilians in occupied territories, maintain sea routes against the US Navy, and their economy was already broken. Japanese steel production peaked in 1942 at 7.8 million tons. After that, it fell every year. In 1944, they produced only 4 million. In 1945, less than 2 million. It wasn't because they were losing factories. It was because they no longer had raw materials. Iron came from Manchuria and the Philippines, but the ships carrying it were sunk by American submarines. Oil came from Indonesia, but the refineries were bombed. Japan was gaining territory, but losing the ability to sustain it. Factories began operating with half the usual materials. Warships were built with low-quality steel. Planes rolled out of factories with structural defects, but this still wasn't the worst. In June 1942, 4 months after Pearl Harbor, came the Battle of Midway. It was the most important naval battle in the Pacific. Japan sent 4 first-line aircraft carriers, the best in the world. The United States had 3, 2 of them damaged, and in 3 days of combat, Japan lost all 4 carriers. It was the breaking point. From that moment on, Japan began losing ground every month, slowly at first, then faster, then in an avalanche. And the government responded with economic madness. They raised military production to 85% of GDP. They shut down civilian goods factories and turned them into arms factories. They forced farmers to deliver rice below market price. The state bought rice at 15 yen per sack and resold it in the cities for 50 yen. It was confiscation with a receipt. Everything was rationed: gasoline, coal, sugar, cloth, soap, shoes. Families received coupons. Without coupons, no purchase. With coupons, no products. Stores were empty, and the informal economy exploded. Black markets multiplied. People traded old clothes for rice, jewelry for coal. Everything had an alternative price. The official currency began to lose meaning, but even that wasn't enough for the regime. They printed yen like pamphlets. By 1943, the amount of money in circulation was double that of 1941. In 1944, triple. By 1945, 6 times more. Inflation exploded. In 1944, prices were rising 50% a year. In 1945, over 300% annually. A worker in Tokyo earned 80 yen a month. A sack of rice cost 60 yen. Before the war, that same worker earned 60 yen and rice cost 8 yen. The math was brutal. People began starving in the cities. Children ate acorns and tree bark. Women sold their silk kimonos for a handful of rice. And military defeats accelerated. In 1944, the United States reconquered the Philippines. They bombed Tokyo. They sank 80% of Japan's merchant fleet. Japan was cut off from its colonies. No more oil coming in. No more iron. No more rubber. Factories began shutting down for lack of fuel. Trains stopped. Ships sat anchored in ports. Planes couldn't take off, but the regime couldn't stop, because stopping meant admitting defeat, and defeat meant the collapse of the entire imperial system. So they continued with the only thing left: fanaticism. They recruited 15-year-old teenagers, trained students to pilot planes on suicide missions. They called this kamikaze, divine wind. They turned planes into human bombs, ships into manned torpedoes, soldiers into living grenades. They called it the unbreakable Japanese spirit. But spirit doesn't stop submarines. It doesn't produce gasoline. It doesn't grow rice. And the final blow was yet to come. August 6, 1945, 8:15 a.m. Clear skies over Hiroshima. A B-29 bomber named Enola Gay dropped a single bomb. It weighed 4 tons. Its name was Little Boy. At 600 meters above ground, it exploded with the force of 15,000 tons of TNT. A white light brighter than 1,000 suns turned the center of Hiroshima into plasma. The temperature reached 3,000 degrees Celsius at ground zero. Winds reached 1,000 kilometers per hour. 70,000 people died instantly. Bodies evaporated. Buildings melted. Metal fused. The shadows of people were burned into walls, and the city ceased to exist. 3 days later, on August 9th, Nagasaki disappeared from the map in the same way. But here's the truth no one tells you. The atomic bombs didn't destroy the Japanese economy. They only accelerated a collapse that was already underway. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, its financial system had been dead for months. Public debt equaled 204% of GDP. It was unpayable, mathematically impossible to settle. Industrial production had fallen 70% from its 1942 peak. Factories stood idle. Machines rusted. Workers were dead or at the front. Cities were in ruins, not because of the atomic bombs, but because of the fire bombings that had been raining down for a year. Tokyo was bombed 102 times, Osaka 97 times, Nagoya 88 times. 40% of Japan's urban areas had been destroyed. Banks were empty, gold reserves spent, war bonds worthless, and the currency was decorative paper. A yen in 1945 was worth less than 1% of its 1937 value. Hyperinflation hit immediately after the war. In 1946, prices were rising more than 500% per year. People bought rice with suitcases full of bills. One egg cost 100 yen, a kilo of rice, 2,000 yen. The average worker earned 300 yen a month. It was impossible to live. Empty markets, closed shops, silent factories, trains without fuel, hospitals without medicine, schools without heat. Japan was gaining territory, but losing the ability to sustain it. Factories began operating with half the materials. Warships were built with low-quality steel. Airplanes left the factories with structural flaws. But this still wasn't the worst part. In June 1942, 4 months after Pearl Harbor, came the Battle of Midway. It was the most important naval battle in the Pacific. Japan sent 4 frontline aircraft carriers, the best in the world. The United States had 3, 2 of them damaged. And in 3 days of fighting, Japan lost all 4 carriers. That was the turning point. From that moment on, Japan began losing ground every month, slowly at first, then faster, then in an avalanche. And the government responded with economic madness. They increased military production to 85% of GDP. They shut down civilian goods factories and converted them into weapons plants. They forced farmers to sell rice below market prices. The state bought rice at 15 yen per sack and resold it in the cities for 50 yen. It was confiscation with a receipt. Everything was rationed. Gasoline, coal, sugar, fabric, soap, shoes. Families received coupons. Without coupons, there was no purchase. With coupons, there were no products. The stores were empty and the informal economy exploded. Black markets multiplied. People traded old clothes for rice, jewelry for coal. Everything had an alternate price. The official currency began to lose meaning. But even that wasn't enough for the regime. They printed yen like pamphlets. By 1943, the money supply had doubled compared to 1941. By 1944, it had tripled. By 1945, it was 6 times higher. Inflation exploded. In 1944, prices rose 50% a year. In 1945, over 300%. A worker in Tokyo earned 80 yen a month. A sack of rice cost 60 yen. Before the war, that same worker earned 60 yen and rice cost 8. The math was brutal. People began starving in the cities. Children ate acorns and tree bark. Women sold their silk kimonos for a handful of rice. And military defeats accelerated. In 1944, the United States retook the Philippines. They bombed Tokyo. They sank 80% of Japan's merchant fleet. Japan was cut off from its colonies. No more oil, no more iron, no more rubber. Factories began to shut down for lack of fuel. Trains stopped. Ships were anchored in ports. Planes couldn't take off. But the regime couldn't stop, because stopping meant admitting defeat. And defeat meant the collapse of the entire imperial system. So they clung to the only thing they had left, fanaticism. They recruited 15-year-old boys, trained students to fly suicide missions. They called them kamikaze, divine wind. They turned planes into human bombs, ships into manned torpedoes, soldiers into living grenades. They called it the unbreakable Japanese spirit. But spirit doesn't stop submarines. It doesn't make gasoline, it doesn't grow rice. And the final blow was yet to come. August 6, 1945, 8:15 a.m. Clear skies over Hiroshima. A B-29 bomber named Enola Gay dropped a single bomb. It weighed 4 tons. It was called Little Boy. At 600 meters above the ground, it exploded with the force of 15,000 tons of TNT. A white light, brighter than 1,000 suns, turned the center of Hiroshima into plasma. The temperature reached 3,000 degrees Celsius at ground zero. Winds hit 1,000 kilometers per hour. 70,000 people died instantly. Bodies evaporated. Buildings melted. Metal fused. The shadows of people were burned onto walls, and the city ceased to exist. 3 days later, on August 9th, Nagasaki vanished from the map in the same way. But here's the truth no one tells you. The atomic bombs didn't destroy the Japanese economy. They only accelerated a collapse already underway. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, its financial system had been dead for months. Public debt stood at 204% of GDP, unpayable, mathematically impossible to settle. Industrial production had fallen 70% from its 1942 peak. Factories were idle, machines rusted, workers were dead or at the front. The cities were ruins, not because of the atomic bombs, but because of the fire bombings that had rained down for a year. Tokyo had been bombed 102 times, Osaka 97, Nagoya 88. 40% of Japan's urban areas were destroyed. The banks were empty, gold reserves spent, war bonds worthless, and the currency was decorative paper. A 1945 yen was worth less than 1% of its 1937 value. Hyperinflation struck immediately after the war. In 1946, prices rose over 500% a year. People bought rice with suitcases full of bills. An egg cost 100 yen. A kilo of rice, 2,000 yen. The average worker earned 300 yen a month. It was impossible to live. Empty markets, closed shops, silent factories, trains without fuel, hospitals without medicine, schools without heat. Then comes dependence, the need to keep growing just to pay for the debt of past growth. Then comes massive debt, bonds, printing, technical justifications. Then comes inflation, slow at first, then explosive. Then comes desperation, price controls, rationing, repression, and finally comes collapse, sudden, total, inevitable. Japan collapsed when its global trade system was cut off by the US. Embargo of 1941. Without oil, without steel, without rubber, the empire crumbled in 4 years. And today, globalization is fracturing before our eyes. BRICS is building alternatives to the dollar. China and Russia trade in yuan and rubles. Saudi Arabia accepts yuan for oil. India buys Russian oil with rupees. Economic sanctions have become the main weapon of geopolitics. Russia was expelled from SWIFT. Iran is blocked. Venezuela is isolated. Cuba has been under embargo for 60 years. And now the United States threatens to sanction any country that trades with its enemies. It's exactly the same chessboard as in 1941, only the pieces have changed. The difference is that in 1941, the US was the only power capable of enforcing total economic blockades. Today that power is being challenged, and when the global trade system fragments, empires that depend on it collapse. Japan learned this in the most brutal way possible. And Japan's most terrifying lesson wasn't that they lost the war, it was that they couldn't stop the machine even when they knew they were heading for the abyss. Japanese leaders knew in 1941 that they couldn't defeat the United States. Admirals said it openly. Generals calculated it. Economists presented the numbers, but they couldn't stop, because once an economy becomes dependent on infinite growth, stopping equals collapse. It's the deadliest trap of modern capitalism. Grow or die. There is no middle ground, no stable plateau. You either grow or you collapse. And when growth is financed by debt, collapse is only a matter of time. Japan bet everything on expansion and lost. The United States is betting everything on the dollar. China is betting everything on manufacturing. Europe is betting everything on integration. And all are playing the same game Japan played in the 1940s, a game where the prize for winning is getting to keep playing, and the punishment for losing is total collapse. The question isn't whether any of these powers will face a crisis. The question is, which one will be first? And when the first falls, it will drag the rest down with it. Because today we are more interconnected than ever. In 1945, when Japan collapsed, the rest of the world kept functioning. But today, if the United States collapses, the dollar collapses. If the dollar collapses, global trade collapses. And if global trade collapses, everything collapses. It's a system too big to fail, until it fails. And we're repeating the same story Japan did, only the names of the currencies have changed. When money dies, everything dies with it. Japan learned this in the most brutal way a nation can learn. They built an empire on an illusion, the illusion that they could conquer the world without the resources to sustain it. They believed that willpower, spirit, discipline, and sacrifice could replace mathematics, and they paid the price with 2 vaporized cities, millions of dead, a lost generation, and 70 years of economic stagnation. Because Japan's collapse didn't end in 1945. Japan rebuilt its economy in the 1950s and 60s, becoming the world's second-largest economy by the 1980s. Everyone spoke of the Japanese miracle, but in 1991 the bubble burst. The real estate market collapsed. The stock market fell 80%, banks failed, and Japan entered 3 decades of stagnation, economists now call the lost decades. Today, in 2025, Japan still carries the debt of its past mistakes, 264% of GDP, the highest in the developed world, because debt never disappears. It only changes hands, it only gets postponed, it only inflates, until it comes due. And when it comes due, it doesn't forgive. The lesson of Japan isn't that they lost the war, it's that they believed in the lie of infinite growth. They believed they could expand forever, conquer forever, grow forever. And when reality arrived, it arrived all at once. The desire to dominate the world is always more expensive than it seems, because it's not about how much you can conquer, it's about how much you can sustain. And when a financial system is built on debt, expansion, and forced growth, collapse isn't a distant possibility. It's a mathematical certainty. Rome fell, Persia fell, Spain fell, England fell, Japan fell. Every empire that confused expansion with strength ended up in the same place, in ruin. And all of them said the same thing before falling. We're different. We're bigger. We're stronger. We're too important to fall. But economic gravity respects no flag. And today's modern powers are playing the same game, with the same rules, the same illusions, and the same ending written in the shadows of the past. The United States believes the dollar is eternal. China believes its manufacturing is invincible. Europe believes integration will save it. But Japan believed too. They believed the emperor was divine, that the Japanese spirit was unbreakable, that willpower could triumph over economics. And on August 15, 1945, all those beliefs evaporated, like Hiroshima. The question isn't whether collapse will come. The question is, who will be next to discover that the economy does not negotiate with faith? And the next empire in our series shows how a single fiscal mistake destroyed 3,000 years of stability and turned the world's oldest civilization into dust. If you want to understand where the world is headed, you can't miss the next chapter. Because history doesn't repeat itself word for word, but it rhymes. And we're hearing the same verse again. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, share this video with someone who needs to understand this. Because collapse doesn't give a warning, it just arrives. And when it does, only those who recognize the signs will be prepared. See you in the next empire.